Okay, I'm going to start the webinar now. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. The webinar is now live.
Good afternoon, fellow Michiganders. My name is Muna Jundi, Chairwoman of the Michigan Women's Commission. I'm excited to welcome you to today's program, Her Voice, Her Vote, celebrating 100 years of the women's vote. We're thrilled that Governor Whitmer, Secretary Benson, and Dr. Rashida Harrison will be joining us live for today's virtual event. And I want to thank Carolyn Casson and Michigan Women Forward for partnering with us on today's virtual event. It's been 100 years, ladies. On this day, August 26, 2020, we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. I can't take that right for granted. Back in the late 1960s in Syria, my father was often visited by the Mukhabarat, or intelligence officers, because he was known to discuss issues related to political reform. They'd harass him in his clinic while seeing patients, and he was banned from leaving the country. That might sound weird, but that was a popular tactic. Basically, they wanted to make his business fail. And what better way than having government agents coming in while patients are sitting in the waiting room? Patients are going to go and find themselves a new doctor. And they prevented him from leaving the country. This would ensure that if he wanted to make a living, he'd have to zip it. He'd always wanted to come and specialize in America, and he knew that it would only get worse for him in Syria. And so in 1970, he and my mother found a way to leave Syria. What he didn't realize was that the situation would get so bad that he'd never be able to return even for a visit. As a daughter of Middle Eastern immigrants who never had the right to vote, I was always taught that this right should not be taken lightly. I mean, if you really want to trigger my dad, tell him that you don't like any of the candidates on the ballot and so you're not voting. He'll corner you and give you a half-hour lecture on how absurd your position is. Every election season, my parents remind me and my siblings to vote, even though they know I vote. I make sure that my 18 and 20-year-old daughters vote, and I've made voter and election protection a personal mission for me as an attorney here in Flint. I've never had to fight and sacrifice to get the right to vote, and my ancestors didn't either. I was born and came of age in an era where that right has always existed for me. But this was a major milestone for women, and not one that happened overnight. When I have conversations with women about this anniversary, a lot are surprised that it's only been 100 years. And I think that it's really important for us to keep having this conversation because we need to remind each other that we didn't always have this right. And so we need to make sure to exercise our right to vote as women. In the next hour, we'll be hearing from some brilliant trailblazing women. But before we jump into the program, I want to share the history that led to the passing of this amendment and recognize a few of my favorite women from Michigan. My 12th grade civics class, yes, I know that was a really long time ago, did teach me about the 19th Amendment. But what it didn't teach me was the role of women in Michigan and how they stood up like thousands of women did across the country. About 10 years after Michigan became a state, really the suffrage movement was in full swing. Suffragists celebrated small milestones and they mourned the losses. But those losses often created momentum. And let me give you an example. In 1866, a suffrage bill was introduced in the Michigan legislature, and it was defeated by just one vote. That didn't stop women. They kept pushing. A few years later, another suffrage bill was introduced. It was passed, but vetoed by the governor. This encouraged women to get more organized in the state. The National Women's Suffrage Association was founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And a year after that, the Michigan chapter was formed in Battle Creek. Black women were often excluded from these groups, and they faced the double bind of sexism and racism. But they didn't wait for an invite into the movement. They forced their place in it by forming their own associations, having events, and using the mighty pen. Sojourner Truth's speech, Ain't I a Woman, is a must read or must hear. You can see reenactments of the speech online. Honestly, it's worth everybody listening to. It's short and it's sweet. She was a former slave, and her fight was for both Blacks and women. I'm hoping to hear more about the intersectionality of race, class, and gender from our first speaker, Dr. Harrison. In 1872, on the day that Susan B. Anthony cast her vote for Ulysses S. Grant in New York, and she was arrested and brought to trial, our own Sojourner Truth went to a polling booth in Battle Creek, demanded a ballot, and was turned away. Then, in 1881, the Michigan legislature took a small step to pass a law that allowed every person age 21 or older who paid taxes in the district to vote on issues related to school. This was an opportunity to expand women's voting rights. And so 3 years later, the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association was formed in Flint with Mary Doe of Bay City as the first president. Yes, Flint represents. She and her colleagues petitioned the Michigan legislature for municipal suffrage. Basically, the argument goes like this: if women could vote on issues related to school, they also should be allowed to vote on issues at their local town meetings. Soon after that, dozens of supportive petitions were sent to the state capitol. Another key player in the women's suffrage movement in Michigan was Lucia Grimes. She was born in Detroit, and she and her husband founded a business in Detroit, and she was the vice president of that business. She introduced the card index filing system, which was later called the pressure system. It recorded the attitude of every Michigan legislator towards women's suffrage. It was so successful that she was invited to Washington, D.C. to institute that system for Congress. And so with her 5-year-old daughter, she headed to D.C. in 1916. This became a very important tool in the women's suffrage movement. And if you're familiar with it, we call it today scorecards, and really any lobbyist worth their grit uses a scorecard to record the attitude of legislators on the issue that they're advocating for. And then they, use that scorecard to help voters decide on what candidates to support in the election. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, and women could vote. But though Black women could vote on paper, in reality, there were still real obstacles, like polling taxes and literacy tests that still stood in the way. The struggle continued until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that was part of the civil rights movement. The right to vote isn't just about showing up. It's also about knowing the issues and the candidates. So sometimes it requires a bit of homework. So my daughter, Jenna, when she got her ballot, her absentee ballot for the August primary, she asked me, she said, Mom, who should I vote for the drain commissioner? And honestly, I was like, what does a drain commissioner even do? So we had to sit down, we had to research, first of all, what's a drain commissioner? Who are the candidates and what's their position? And if you're smart like me, I handed that responsibility off to my sister. So she came back with the answer for us. And I knew that we would agree with her. So we got to get educated about who's on the ballot and what the issues are on the ballot. It's also about ensuring that everyone has the right to vote. I've been volunteering for voter and election protection for over a decade. And honestly, I think any woman that can do it, she should. And how do you do that? You can sign up to become a poll observer, or you can be an election challenger, or you can be an election inspector. So we here in Flint, for example, my colleague Alec Gibbs and I, of the cooperating attorney with the ACLU of Michigan, we decided to institute a sort of pilot project where we encouraged young university students to become election inspectors. Basically, it means poll workers. They get trained and they get paid to work that day on election day. And we had a couple of dozen that have now registered and been trained, and they've actually worked in elections. Now, this to me is very important. One is we obviously need to pass on the baton to the younger generation, but we need to encourage our young women for civic engagement, because this right to vote didn't exist, and there always will be people putting obstacles in the way, and we should be at the forefront of trying to make sure that everybody has the right to vote. I could continue talking and mentioning other women, but honestly, I know y'all didn't get on this so you could hear me. So I am going to introduce to you our first speaker, who I'm excited to hear from, Dr. Rashida Harrison, who's an assistant professor at MSU's James Madison College. Dr. Harrison earned her PhD in African American and African Studies with disciplinary foci in sociology and literature at MSU. She earned her BA from Cornell in Africana Studies with a minor in sociology. Professor Harrison's teaching reflects her interest and includes courses on social theory, social movements, intersections of race, class, gender, and sexuality, global citizenships, and race and citizenship, to name a few. Born and raised in New York City's iconic South Bronx, Rashida engaged the politics of race, gender, and consciousness at an early age. These formative experiences deepened her understanding of the African Black diaspora and inspired her early career research into how women build coalitions across social identities, political realities, and national borders. She's also a proud mother of an almost 2-year-old son. Please welcome Dr. Harrison.
You're on mute.
Hi, good afternoon. First, I want to thank the Michigan Women's Commission for inviting me to celebrate the centennial to the 19th Amendment. It is an honor to share in this space with Chair Muna Jundi, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, and Governor Gretchen Whitmer. I want to take a few minutes of your time to talk about the role of Black women in the fight for universal suffrage. And I'd like to offer 3 major points for your consideration. First, Black women recognized that the 19th Amendment was an important milestone in the fight for universal suffrage, but understood they still had more work to do to challenge practices normalized under racial tyranny. Second, Black women organized strategically against the political and social barriers that proved a threat to their families and communities. And 3, the success and continued work done by Black women and women of color on a multitude of fronts in this moment is part of a historical continuum. And without this work, this country would look very different. With regards to my first point, we rightly so look to the 19th Amendment as a victory for not just women, but the country, in that with this amendment, it was set in motion the possibility for all adults considered American to now have full democratic citizenship rights. I say possibility because the amendment read, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex," end quote. Nevertheless, this country was still very much steeped in its project of racial tyranny, a project that sometimes legally and more widespread socially permitted denial of the vote based on race and subsequently gender and class. This meant that Black women and many other women throughout the country, even if they were not under the immediate reign of Southern Jim Crow, still experienced violence and disenfranchisement. Denying the vote took the form of unjust and arbitrary laws created after the 15th Amendment, which you may remember is the amendment that granted the right to vote to all men, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. States enacted laws that implicated class and consequently impacted many people, including African Americans, other people of color, as well as white immigrants in the North. Laws such as poll taxes, literacy tax, the grandfather clause. Now, even as these laws were, and iterations of these laws were challenged, even before the passage of the 19th Amendment, the culture of denial of citizenship and voter suppression meant that Black women in particular would risk their lives to exercise this now legal right. My second point is that Black women organized strategically. It's important for us to understand as we reflect on suffrage that this was at least a century-long effort that occurred on multiple fronts and was always a multiracial movement. It was one born directly out of the abolitionist movement, a multiracial movement to end the violent and racist institution of slavery. An institution that resulted in many people, particularly those possessing whiteness, generating wealth, property, and power, while vehemently denying access to such things to many other citizens, particularly citizens of color. When learning about suffrage in mainstream history, we often may have learned and heard about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton for good reasons. And many of us have learned about the important work of former enslaved folk like Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth, and that they advocated for all women's suffrage. But we are not told the stories of the countless other Black women who worked before and after emancipation to ensure basic civil rights for African Americans in this country. We are not told about the Black women who worked and provided the language and framework in which all women would come to understand that democracy cannot be realized in a nation that does not ensure equal political participation of its citizens. Black women such as Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Mary McLeod Bethune, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and later Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Chisholm, just to name a few. Often, if you have heard of these women, you may have heard of their contributions to journalism, education, family support, and other women's political platforms, which is really important. Ruffin, for example, was the editor of the first national newspaper published by an African American woman, right? Ida B. Wells, also a journalist, was well known for making public the state and vigilante systemic violence occurring through the lynching of Black men and women in the late 19th and early 20th century. What we do not learn is how deeply connected the fight against racialized violence, for example, was to equal citizenship. We do not learn that seeking justice was intertwined with pushing back against unjust laws that relegated Black and other non-white citizens as second class. We don't learn that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was not only a writer in the 19th century, but an orator who spoke and advocated specifically for all women's rights to vote, women's right to vote. And she was one of the founding members of the 1869 American Women's Suffrage Association. We don't learn about the Black women's club movements or that one of the oldest Black organization was the National Association of Colored Women's Club, started in 1896. The motto of lifting as we climb reflected the important work they did in their communities, from educating, providing health resources and clinics, daycares, job trainings, as well as the journalism and speaking publicly on the need for all women to have the right to vote. And we definitely do not invoke enough the name of Fannie Lou Hamer, who sacrificed her body and soul for the right to equal access to the vote and the securing of the important Voting Rights Act of 1965. These women worked tirelessly both at the grassroots and larger public service level to ensure more equitable experiences, and the right to vote was an important element in that quest. One of the things I tell my students often is history does not repeat itself, but rather we are part of an important historical continuum. That means Kamala Harris as the first Black and Asian American woman to be a nominee on a major party ticket for vice president is not disconnected from the 2008 Green Party presidential nomination of Cynthia McKinney, which is not disconnected from the important position held by Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice from 2005 to 2009. And of course, they are all part of a historical lineage that contained the great Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman elected to Congress. She was also the first African American and woman, period, to seek the nomination of President of the United States from a major political party in 1972. Chisholm talked about being unbought and unbossed. She was not willing to sacrifice her commitments to her community as a Black woman as she pushed for a seat at the table, a table that historically did not center the needs of people of color or any woman for that matter in this country. What's also important here is that the precedent set by Black women is one that sets the stage for all women. We wouldn't have had a Secretary Albright and later a presidential nominee Clinton without the work of a Chisholm or the many other Black women that worked up through civil rights and the road to securing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They also set the stage for the historic number of women and women of color that now reside in political positions all over this country at the state and federal level. As we celebrate the centennial, we must always, always keep in mind an intersectional perspective. When we band together as women from all different backgrounds, we must understand that race, class, religion, national origin, ability, gender identity, etc., all impact women's political experiences differently. And when we work, we ought to acknowledge and talk about those differences. We have to remember that legal barriers still existed for Native American women up and through 1947, 1948, and that in 1952, the right to vote is secured for all Asian American people, right? We have to remember this, that the centennial was but a milestone to get us to 45 years later of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We ought to discuss the power relations that exist within groups of women and understand that when we work on behalf of our most vulnerable, we are working to ensure more equity for all of us. This is a notion that I learned from both my professional and personal position as a Black feminist. It is a lesson taken up by the countless number of Black women and women of color organizing at this very moment, whether it's with one of our largest movements, and that's the movement for Black lives, a larger multiracial and anti-racist movement, or if it's just the grassroots level working that's going on in different communities, whether it's working on behalf of poor mothers, working mothers, women of color facing healthcare discrimination, and the number of organizations that's working to empower young girls. The list goes on because women have always worked and we will continue to work. Black women have always been an important piece to the political progress, not just for Black folk in this country, but for all people in this country. And we will continue to be. I encourage you this year and all subsequent years to continue the work and exercise this important right that so many of us continue to work to ensure. Please go vote. Thank you so much.
I'm ecstatic to have the opportunity to celebrate the centennial of women's suffrage with you all. Not only did the 19th Amendment give women the right to vote, it made it possible for women to run for elective office and win.
It's a reflection both of how far we've come and also, how recent it was that women had the right to vote. 100 years is a generation and a half.
When you think about it, our grandmothers grew up in a world, and great-grandmothers, that didn't have the right to vote for them.
And it's important for actually a number of reasons, not merely because it represents the moment where women become full citizens in this country, but it also reminds me, as a woman who is the descendant of an enslaved folk of this country, it reminds me of all the hard work that people in my family and my community did in order for me to be here and for me to go to the polls and cast my vote.
Women fought and died for this opportunity for us to utilize our voice for change. But it's also important to know and remember that not all of us had the right at the same time.
Just not even 30 or 40 years ago, Indigenous people were not even guaranteed the right to vote in all 50 states. So looking back, remembering how far we have come in achieving voter equality, it's really important to continue to reflect on how much more we have to do and how much our vote matters in ensuring voter equality.
It took many, many years and decades for all women, women of color, to make sure that that right was guaranteed. But what that really signaled was the beginning of our voices getting stronger in policy and representation.
Every voting rights achievement makes us a more perfect union. Each gain bends the arc of history a bit closer to justice.
Thank you, and once again, happy centennial.
A special thank you to Hannah Hebner and Megan Bergman of Michigan Women Forward for producing that and the other videos for today's event. They beautifully captured the voices of some of Michigan's women leaders as they talk about the importance of celebrating 100 years of the women's vote. Now, in order to introduce my next speaker, I can't start without talking about Prop 3. The passing of Proposal 3 in 2018 gave Michiganders no reason absentee ballot voting and same-day voter registration. Secretary Benson has her hands full. She's trying to implement these new rules and responding to lawsuits challenging her implementation of these new rules. I did see that the court ruled yesterday on one of these cases where she was challenged for sending out unsolicited absentee ballot applications to all registered voters in Michigan. And basically the argument was she didn't have the authority to do that. I'm glad to say the court ruled in her, or should I say our, favor. So while we're all here encouraging women to vote, let's remember that there are others using whatever options they have available to them to limit that right. Please welcome Secretary Benson.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I kept starting it and then it would go. Anyway, how great to see all of you virtually. And I really wish we were all able to be there in person together celebrating this enormous centennial and all that it means for all of us. I want to talk, I know you've been talking and heard a great deal already about the importance of women's voices being heard and how that really ensures that every voice is at the table and every issue is fully represented and all perspectives are fully represented at the table. I wanted to talk today a little bit about, now in the next 10 weeks, we've got a historic presidential election on the horizon and a lot, as was mentioned, of new laws and protections in place for our citizens to ensure that their access to the vote is truly realized. I want to talk a little bit about what we know as we've worked to implement those changes over the past year and a half and what we can expect for November and what we're doing to get ready for November. But the bottom line is we are really in the best position possible to show the country how you successfully run an election in the midst of a pandemic. That said, it's not without its challenges, particularly when it comes to the fact that we're in a very intense moment of deep division in our country. And there are voices at play trying to sow deeper those divisions in a way that would undermine the very fabric of our democracy and question its sanctity and security, and sow seeds of doubt among the electorate about whether they can have faith in the entire process. So we're really standing in guard this year against those types of attacks on our democratic system, the spread of misinformation to our voters designed to, in many ways, discourage them from voting and through that suppress their voices. And that affects women and men equally, but certainly when you have historically disenfranchised communities of color, women voters across the board, it's all the more important that we stand together to push back against any and all attacks on the sanctity of our democratic process that come often in the form of trying to confuse voters about their rights at this very uniquely challenging moment of great uncertainty. But that said, My job has been to counter all of that by, in particular, recognizing that in this moment of great uncertainty, we need to give our citizens clarity on how exactly to ensure their voices are heard this year. And that's really the work we've been involved in since the pandemic began in March and really took hold of our state, but even before that as well. In Proposal 3, as was mentioned, there were enormous changes to our election law, both in the category of how people get registered and also in the category of how people vote. In the area of getting people registered to vote, you've got changes like enabling citizens to register up to and on election day itself, the ability for citizens or the right for them to be automatically registered to vote when they come into our offices and get a driver's license or state ID. And also, we've implemented online voter registration for the first time this year, enabling citizens with a driver's license or ID to go online and register to vote right then and there. These have been crucial in ensuring that all citizens are able to vote and all eligible voters are able to cast their votes effectively without the unnecessary barrier of having to register 30 days prior to an election day in order for for the ability to vote in that particular election. But that said, there's a flip side also, and that is ensuring that citizens can have choices at their disposal to vote safely and securely this year. And in casting a ballot, Proposal 3 gave citizens a right to cast that through the mail. And also, if possible, if they so choose, early in person at their clerk's office. So what that means is for this fall's election, as well as for every election to follow and every election that's preceded this one since I took office, citizens have 3 choices for how to vote in an election. Number 1, you can vote through the mail, requesting a ballot to be mailed to you, which you can then return at a local drop box, at your local clerk's office, or through the mail. Number 2, 40 days prior to the election, you can begin voting in person at your clerk's office. You can show up anytime after September 24th for this November 3rd election and request your ballot. You can receive it right there. You can fill it out and return it and be done. That option is new. It's in place because it's essentially seen as absentee voting without the process of having to send and return a ballot through the mail. Finally, of course, your ability to vote in person at your local precinct remains in the law, remains protected. And we've also been working hard to make sure that our precincts remain open this year, recruiting new poll workers to help us staff them at a time when many traditional poll workers may be immune compromised or otherwise unable to work this year. What that all means is that we've been able to hold several successful elections, both last year and this year in particular, in the midst of record turnout, which we're also anticipating we will see in November. Meaning more people will vote in Michigan this November than ever before in our state's history. How do we know that? A couple of things. One, more people voted in this recent August primary than had ever voted in an August primary before in our state. 2.5 million citizens voted. That exceeded the 2.2 million who voted in the 2018 August primary, where there was a contested statewide election for governor on the ballot. And on both sides of the aisle. And so here in 2020, without any contested elections at the statewide level, you still saw turnout that exceeded more intense campaigns with more attention in the past, which really underscores that even in the midst of a pandemic, citizens want to vote this year. And they want to vote with options, because in the August primary, 1.6 million citizens chose to vote through the mail or early prior to election day, and just under 1 million voted on election day itself. What that meant is not only that we had more people voting early than ever before, but we also were able to have that in-person voting without any crowds. It's one of the only ways that you can handle a high turnout election in the midst of a pandemic where we can't have crowds. We want people to stay healthy. You enable people to vote early or vote through the mail, and then less people show up on election day, and that minimizes crowds. Importantly, in August, we saw 0 lines, 0 crowding. Our poll workers had masks and gloves and PPE available to protect their health and safety, and voting went smoothly on all fronts. There are always challenges, there are always nuances, and we are in the weeks ahead going to do a deep dive, not just in Detroit, but throughout the state, to identify any issues that we want to resolve and plan for and protect for November. One of the biggest ones is the fact that with these new changes in place, we're still waiting for the legislature to update their laws and the laws in our statutes to provide citizens full access and our clerks full support in administering and implementing and taking advantage of these new laws. In particular, there are three things that we saw in August that really wouldn't have happened if the legislature had acted as we've been asking them to do for nearly a year and a half now. The first is our clerks and those counting absentee ballots were under a lot of stress, undue stress and pressure to get those ballots counted and the results announced quickly. We know that pressure is only going to increase in magnitude and in volume in November. Nevertheless, we've asked the legislature to give our clerks the ability to open envelopes and begin processing them, sorting into piles and all the rest to be counted on election day, on the day before election day. It's a basic thing that anyone running a business or any type of operation would want to do. Yet the legislature has not given our clerks the ability, the legal authority to do that. And it's caused a lot of problems. It caused problems in August, some of which you may be hearing about in Detroit, but it's going to cause even more problems in November if our legislature doesn't act. So we really need them to be a partner, a full partner in this, not just in that regard, but also in making sure that every valid vote that is cast is counted, meaning that in the August primary, so many people voted through the mail. Yet a lot of people, 6,400 people to be exact, voted through the mail, dropped their ballots in the mail prior to election day, but those ballots were not ultimately received by the clerks until a day or two after election day. Now, in many states, those ballots would still count, but not in Michigan. In Michigan, a ballot has to be received by 8 p.m. on election day in order to count. Now, in my view, voters should not be disenfranchised through no fault of their own. If they've returned their ballot on time, it should count. Yet that isn't the case, and that's not what happened in our August primary. And unless the law changes, we're set up for a scenario in November with increasing new challenges to the Postal Service, where we could see upwards of 10 or 12,000 otherwise valid votes uncounted, left uncounted, because they were delivered after election day. To mitigate this, we have set up drop boxes all around the state and for citizens to drop off ballots in order to have them picked up and delivered and counted on time. If a ballot's in a drop box by 8 p.m. on election day, it will count. But of course, it's little, no real substitute for what a fully working postal service and the ability to have that safety net if it's received the next day, it still counts, would mean for our voters. Finally, we also know that a lot of people are voting by mail for the first time, particularly in November's election. And we want to do everything we can to ensure voters are fully informed on how to make sure their vote counts. That means not just voting early and getting your ballot in and making sure it's counted, which you can do through our ballot tracking system on our website, michigan.gov/vote. But it also means making sure you're following all the instructions. You're completing your ballot correctly, you're signing the envelope outside the ballot, and you're returning that in the envelope with a signature, and that signature is going to match your signature on your voter registration form. In other words, you've got to do more work this year if you're going to vote by mail to make sure your ballot is actually counted. But if you're willing to do that and go that extra mile, you can vote by mail, as millions of citizens will likely do in November. We're estimating 3 million because 2.4 have already requested to vote by mail. So doing that means being even more prepared to ensure your ballot's counted. And my hope is that all of you can join us in increasing the amount of information and the education we're providing for our citizens all throughout the state, and help us get the word out about how people can request their ballot, how they can return their ballot, and how they can ensure that it's counted. Michigan.gov/vote is the portal with all the information you need to know about voting in Michigan this year. And you can also always contact your local clerk with questions as well. So that's a glimpse into what we're doing to prepare for November. Our work is significant, but with partnerships, we can make it all happen. Partnerships with our sports teams, with our local businesses, with employers, and with all of you. So my last ask is that you'll consider serving as an election worker this fall. You can go to michigan.gov/democracy MVP to sign up. but serving as an election worker really is the most effective way that you can, other than being a voter, ensure that other votes are protected on election day, and that the results of our election are an accurate reflection of the will of the people. So that said, thank you again for having me here today. Great to see all of you virtually through the screen, and hope to see all of you in person again soon.
Participation in the political process is essential to affirming the rights we have today and creating a better, more equitable world for the next generation.
Etymologically, vote comes from Latin and means a vow. And I like that because it suggests that when you vote, you're making a kind of promise, investing in a level of involvement and participation and responsibility.
We have fought for the right to vote. Women died for the right to vote. And what a lot of people don't realize is every time you skip an election, you're effectively giving somebody else the power to make decisions for you. And statistically, that is going to be an older white guy.
We are half of the population. We should be half of the folks at the table making those decisions.
We want to be able to have you as young women, for example, to live a life where you can explore and learn and enjoy your life and be free also to live the kind of life you want to live. And so that can only happen if we exercise our right to vote.
If you're not voting, then your voices are not only not being heard, but the issues that matter to you that impact your daily lives, be it related to education or healthcare or the roads, all of those decisions are made and being made without your input.
One of the things that I hear from women is that you don't feel like you know enough to get involved. You don't know every policy issue. You don't know who's running at every level. There are so many resources out there. And trust me, when you look around at some of the men who are making decisions, you are much more qualified than you give yourself credit for. Let me tell you this right now.
Your story, your family's experience matters. And without your participation, we're missing out on your really critical expertise, insight, and perspectives.
One of the most important things we have to do is to be involved and to make sure that every woman we know who has the right to vote, it shouldn't have taken 100 years to get them the right to vote, but now it's one of the most important responsibilities we have.
You have to vote, be willing to see your own name on the ballot, be willing to vote for other women on the ballot, and understand if you're not in the room, if you're not participating, you're not going to have the opportunity to be heard.
I'm an American and I'm a proud American, and I go to the polls to have my voice heard and have representation that truly represents me and my American ideals.
Congratulations on the centennial anniversary of the right to vote. Now it's our responsibility to make sure we do.
Our next speaker is Governor Whitmer. She needs no introduction. She's made the rights of all women in the state a priority, and starting last fall, she joined the Michigan Women's Commission for conversations with women across Michigan to understand their concerns, their priorities, and to learn their strengths. From Grand Traverse County to Genesee County to Detroit and Grand Rapids. Please welcome Madam Governor.
I'm trying to start the video, Mona. Let's see. All right, there we go. There. All right, I'm here, good, thank you. Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to everyone who is participating, including, of course, Dr. Harrison and Jocelyn Benson. I thank my lucky stars that in 2018, we were wise enough to amend our Constitution to make it easier to vote from home. Who knew we would be in the midst of a global pandemic and that would literally be life and death, but also that we've got Jocelyn Benson and Dana Nessel to defend it and to ensure that we do everything we can to make it easier for people to vote. And Chairwoman Jondi, thank you so much for your service to our state. I'm really honored to be here with all of you. And one of the questions was, what does suffrage mean to me? And I'll tell you, I remember voting young with my parents, and that's why when I became a parent, I took my girls with me every single election. And now one of those girls is 18 years old, voted for the first time in the primary, and will be casting her first vote for president this fall. And I can tell you she's very excited to do it. And I think she and her generation give me so much inspiration and optimism about our future, because there are a lot of examples and reasons why we could feel pretty down in the mouth right now about what's going on in our country. And yet this generation is bolder than ever, is strong. And that's what drives the work that I'm doing every single day. And so today, as we celebrate the progress that was made over the past 100 years, we got to pause and recognize and educate the world that it took longer for Black and brown women who continued to fight for decades after the 19th Amendment was passed so that they could cast their ballots as well. And we also have to recognize that there still are many barriers that exist between women and casting that right to vote. And I pledge that we will continue to work together to knock down those barriers. You know, earlier this year, I attended each of the gender equity conversations hosted by the Women's Commission, and had the chance to hear from women all across our great state about what their concerns are, what their needs are, what they're confronting in their communities or in their workplaces. And one point that was repeatedly raised, that was loud and clear and across the board, was that we can't achieve gender equity without true economic security. And that's why today we have announced that the Michigan Women's Commission will be moving to the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. We recognize that this is essential to not just women in the workforce, but all of the families that we're raising, to all of the families that we support, our parents and our kids alike, and for every woman. We know that equity is crucial. We know that affordable and available health care and child care are critical. Paid parental leave. As a member of the sandwich generation, where I took care of a parent who was dying and a child who was newly born, it's front and center for me and for the work that we are going to do, and we're going to work together and we're going to get it done. So we can't really brag that Michigan is a home for opportunity until Michigan, all women have had the same opportunities and are successful in it. And so I'm confident that through the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity and the Michigan Women's Commission, working together and collaborating with all of you as well, I know that we can continue breaking down these barriers for Michigan women and show the rest of the country what it means to truly be an equitable state. We're going to take more steps forward in ensuring that women are treated with the same dignity and respect as their male counterparts, no matter their race or socioeconomic status or sexual orientation. From day one, this administration we've made a commitment to building a stronger, more equitable state, and we live our values in this administration. And the first month in office, I signed an executive directive to secure equal pay for equal work in state government. We know that this is still an important tool that we need to extend to the private sector. We've made sure to not only women have a seat at the table in my administration, but I got to tell you, more often than not, we're the majority at the tables and in my office and in our leadership team. Both the executive office staff and the cabinet are more than 2/3 women. And these are people who are sitting at the table when we make decisions about the future of our state. And I often think about how different that table looks from Michigan to Washington, D.C., or just Michigan 4 years ago, and how different it must look from the tables of decision makers in Ohio, just to the south of us, or all across the country. When I was a candidate for governor, I made sure that I got into all 83 counties because I wanted to know what people needed the most, what our platform should be, and focus on solving real problems. Spoke and I listened to people. And that's what we built the campaign on. And that's what I have built our agenda on, whether it's the structuring of state government to the writing of the state budget. I know that there are moms who want to drive their kids to school and not spend a week's rent on fixing a busted rim. I know that there are moms who want to be able to hand their child a glass of water out of the tap and know it's going to be safe for their child. Moms who need some help with childcare between when their kids are at school and when they're home. And especially in the midst of a global pandemic, we know how acute those critical issues are right now. So I want to tell you that the work that we do is critical importance, and the work that this commission does and the work that all of you are, all the hats that you wear, I thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of all women and on behalf of my girls here in Michigan as well. I want to end by encouraging everyone on this call to vote in this year's election. It's going to be a lot different. Secretary Benson and I have been working very closely. She's planning for a historic turnout and in an unconventional way, and certainly tough circumstances. And that's why you should, if you haven't, request your absentee ballot right now. If you're able to, as she suggested, volunteer and to work in the elections this November. We know that when women vote, we elect leaders who focus on the things that matter, not just to us, but to our families and our children and our older parents as well. So if you know someone who's on the fence about who they're going to vote for in this election, or they're concerned about issues and maybe they haven't voted before and they're paying attention now, or maybe they're not, and you need to help make sure that this is front and center for them, please take it upon yourself to be an ambassador for election participation, because it's not just two names on a ballot. What's on the ballot is our ability to take care of our kids. What's on the ballot is our ability to have dignity and equity in the workplace. What's on the ballot is all of this and much, much more. So thank you for the work that you are doing. Thank you for participating in today's event. It's wonderful to celebrate 100 years of suffrage, but it's also an important thing for us to continue to ensure that people remember how critical it is that we continue to exercise that right that we earned 100 years ago for many of us, decades ago for others. It's all of our right now, and it is all of our responsibility to participate in this election. Our lives are counting on it. So thank you, everybody.
You know, women's issues are everyone's issues. We all want our families to succeed, and we all want to improve lives.
The fact that women are so disrespected by some of our current leadership, that women have had enough.
We're tired of being silenced and not heard when we are part of one of the, if not the largest groups in this country.
So women are being driven to the polls, number one, for fairness. We care about our communities. We care about each other. We want to make sure that everybody has a chance.
In my community, we have a saying that any decision that you make today is reflected on the next 7 generations. So when women are going to the polls, I really believe that they are driven by those next 7 generations.
These are the issues that I think are important and that will drive women to the polls, especially now. Certainly income equality, childcare, especially during this pandemic, has been turned on its head.
Childcare is not a frill. It's a basic economic issue.
Children in cages at the southern border, mothers whose children were ripped from their arms.
And we want our girls to be able to decide what to do in future generations with their own bodies and not having the government tell them what to do.
Violence against women, our sexual assault and domestic violence. What are you doing in order to ensure that women are protected?
We are voting for an economy that is available and fair for everybody to have a fair shot. From the smallest business, if you are a woman that's maxed out her credit cards or done a second mortgage on the house to do that small business you always wanted to do, you need to know somebody's got your back.
Who's in office makes a big difference in whether or not we're able to advance equal pay, and whether we're able to address sexual assault, and whether we're able to address paid family leave and paid sick leave.
It's not just the traditional women's issues, although those are important, but it's also the fact that I've watched my community be ravaged by mass incarceration, right? It is about education.
Women care about people. We care about our communities. We care about each other. And the most powerful thing we can do is vote.
While we have made incredible gains in equality over the past 100 years, we still have a long way to go. And there are a number of issues on the ballot this year that affect the everyday lives of women across Michigan. It's critical that we elect leaders who will continue to fight to ensure true gender equity is achieved.
Well, thank you, everybody. They really covered it, didn't they? There are so many reasons that drive women to the polls. When the governor joined the Michigan Women's Commission for Conversations across the state, the question was, what will it take to achieve gender equity in your community? No matter where we were, women cited pay equity, affordable, accessible childcare, paid parental and family leave, and the need for more women in leadership positions in government, nonprofits, academia, and business. We heard you, we see you, and the Michigan Women's Commission has formed working committees to make policy recommendations to the governor to help address these issues for the women of Michigan and to make gender equity a reality. You can go to Michigan MWC website at michigan.gov/MWC to learn more about the commission's work. And you can visit Michigan Women Forward at miwf.org to schedule a visit to the Michigan Women's History Center in downtown Lansing to learn the history of the Michigan women's suffrage movement. Thank you again to Governor Whitmer, Secretary Benson, and Dr. Harrison and Michigan Women Forward for making today's celebration. Now, take your friends, your family, and go out and vote. Thank you.